Hi, I'm Susan Swain, host of C-SPAN's Q&A, where we spend an hour with nonfiction writers and historians who add context to today's news. On this episode, we set the stage for President-elect Joe Biden's inaugural address. Our guests are Sarada Peri, senior speechwriter for President Barack Obama, and John McConnell, a senior speechwriter for President George W. Bush. They join me to talk about the significance of presidential inaugural addresses with examples from JFK to President Trump. Our guests this week are two presidential speechwriters, John McConnell, senior speechwriter for George W. Bush and Dick Cheney, and Sarada Peri, who is a senior speechwriter for Barack Obama. And we're going to explore presidential inaugural addresses. I think about Joe Biden's task, and it seems like for someone who has sought this office for many, many years, he's got the speech of his lifetime ahead of him on January 20th. How did the events of January 6th at the Capitol change the urgency and the kind of messaging that he needs to do in this speech? Let's start with John McConnell.
I think the most important thing is that the events of last Wednesday have expanded the audience for President Biden's inaugural address. Everybody is going to be paying attention very closely to not just what he says, but how he says it. Biden has been a public figure for almost 50 years. He's very familiar to Americans, especially because of his service as vice president to Barack Obama for 8 years. So people know him. People have a general sense of his character and his personality. And I think what he needs to do on Inauguration Day is just to project his best thoughts and show what kind of a person he is. And I think if you look at inaugural addresses through American history, the best ones, the most effective ones, are the ones in which the new president points forward and really talks about his agenda, not necessarily in great specificity because you don't have the time to do that, and it's more of a thematic speech, but point clearly and confidently forward. And as I say, I don't know how much recent events or current headlines really need to be talked about in an inaugural address, as opposed to simply the great principles and beliefs that the incoming president has and wants to put at the service of his new administration.
Sarada Peri?
Yeah, I would agree with John, and I think this is a moment where, as John said, it's not necessarily that he has to articulate a series of policies, but he almost is going to offer not just sort of a vision of where he wants to take America, but a sensibility. Speeches have, especially inaugural addresses, have a kind of feel, a sense of the almost ambiance of where the new president plans to take the country. So if you think about JFK's inaugural, there was a feeling of freshness, of newness, of turning the page on an older generation and bringing in the new one. And so you get that sense from inaugurals. And so this is going to be an opportunity for President-elect Biden to offer what he thinks the tone of this moment ought to be. And it's not a job I envy given the recent events. And so while he may not speak about them specifically, his sort of affirmative vision of the America he plans to govern almost implicitly will be a response to current events.
As presidential speechwriters are inherently students of history, and Joe Biden will be taking the oath dealing with so many issues: an angry and divided electorate, a possible impeachment process of his predecessor, a pandemic, an economic crisis. Can either of you think of any historical parallels for this many issues facing an incoming president?
Well, it's really interesting when you look across American history. Number one, how many times the nation has been closely divided in a presidential election. It is amazing. I mean, not just in modern times, Bush v. Gore, Kennedy and Nixon, Nixon and Humphrey, Kennedy and Nixon separated by 100,000 votes nationwide, I think. Wilson running for re-election in 1916, and then a series of elections after the Civil War where it was really, really on the knife's edge. That's number one. And number two, there have been a pretty large number of presidents coming in at moments of crisis. I mean, you think right away of Franklin D. Roosevelt at the height of the Great Depression. Ronald Reagan came in at a moment of real economic, not calamity, but great concern in the country. And there are just many instances of this. Biden, of course, has a series of crises and challenges of his own, but you go back through history, and there's just many instances of presidents having to deal with these things. And so I again go back to the point that if he's confident and pointing forward and speaks about principles and maybe even a little bit about American history, as many presidents have done in his inaugural address, he'll set just the right tone for his administration going forward.
Sarada Peri, John McConnell mentioned that the audience will be much larger for incoming President Biden for this speech. But I'm wondering, what are the key audiences that this and any inaugural address really aim toward?
Well, an inaugural address it's no longer a campaign speech, right? I mean, it is the president's first official address. It's not a coronation, but it is the moment when a president is becoming the president of all Americans. He's no longer just speaking to Democrats, and he's no longer speaking against Republicans. And so, in a way, unlike many other speeches, this speech is, directed towards the American people, but also actually the world. You're in a way asking me to minimize the audience, but actually I would argue that this speech has a global audience because the world is looking for what this new leader will bring. What will a new President Biden and his administration bring? And their fortunes rest on that too. And so I think for any speech, you want to consider what sort of the emotional heart center is. And I think in this moment when our country is so divided, he needs to come back to those first principles, as John said, and speak about the values that bind us while being extremely clear-eyed about the things that at the moment are causing such division. But I think he does need to be mindful of frankly, the vastness of the audience. That doesn't mean that he's offering different messages to those audiences. I think that if he sort of speaks about that affirmative vision that he has, it will reach all audiences. And what is unique about Joe Biden, I think, among a lot of politicians, is that what you see is what you get. He is himself. He has been the same person that has been in public life for as long as he's been in public life. And so I think we will see that essence again on this biggest stage of his life.
John McConnell, how important is speaking to history when you're crafting an inaugural address?
Well, I used to get that question when I was writing speeches for President Bush, and I always tried to change the subject, because if you're thinking about history in writing a speech, it doesn't help in the process. You really need to keep focused on the project at hand and on putting your best thoughts down and getting the president's voice. History, people look back at inaugural addresses and they set the stage in a certain sense for administrations. But for most presidents, their most significant speech was not their inaugural address. People go back to them, but I can't think of many presidents of whom the typical American would say, boy, that inaugural address, that was the thing I remember about him. There's very few of them. So it's a very important speech, but it's part of a narrative arc of that president, and Joe Biden will say things that are much more newsworthy within a few days of being inaugurated. But that speech, I think, it just needs to be forward-looking, conversational in tone. I don't think that people are looking for, in the times we live in, high oratory. They're just looking for, I think right now especially, a really good sense of the man, and that's why Sarada is right about the world watching as well. People are just very curious about this man who they're familiar with, but have never seen in this role.
Well, Sarada Peri, following up on John McConnell's point, if Lincoln's second inaugural is considered the greatest of all times, are there any other gold standard presidential inaugural speeches that you as speechwriters might go back and study if you were given this task?
Oh, sure. I mean, I think it's actually, to John's point, it's actually worth going back and reading as many of them as one can if you're preparing this address, or just if you're interested in history in general, because while few of them stand out, in sort of together, when you read them, they offer a snapshot or really a pastiche of American history. You get a sense of what these leaders were dealing with sort of in context. And so they're worth reviewing. I think FDR's first inaugural was quite remarkable. And again, coming in a time of crisis, coming out of the Hoover administration and at a moment when the American people were truly in crisis, hunger lines and people had lost their jobs and the banks were going under. And it was a really horrible time for the American people. And for so long, they had been feeling as though there was nothing that could be done about it. And so, again, not even talking specifically about programs, what FDR did there was inject a sense of possibility, not sort of wide-eyed, naive possibility, but a sense of the people having agency again. And that was a huge sort of tone shift from the Hoover administration. So I think that is sort of one of your gold standards. Obviously, JFK's inaugural is widely considered to be a particularly beautiful one, and again had a particular tone about it. And when Ted Sorensen, his longtime speechwriter and thought partner, wrote in his biography of Kennedy sort of what the process was like, and they had been collecting fragments of ideas and phrases. And he had to dip into that in order to write President Kennedy's farewell speech to Massachusetts when he left the Senate, and hadn't wanted to. But then when then President Kennedy asked him to read previous inaugurals and found that most of them were just not all that great. But the one thing he noted was that they were also very long. And so his goal was to make President Kennedy's as short as possible. And it ended up being the shortest since Teddy Roosevelt's. But again, I think he seized it as an opportunity to offer an affirmative vision of what America could be. We're turning away from sort of what we have been going through. We're post-war generation. Now we're sort of seizing upon a community, and we're trying to sort of inject this idea not just of a community of our country, but a community of nations, and introducing this idea of what citizenship really is. So I think for a bunch of reasons, the Kennedy inaugural is considered a gold standard. And President Obama, in his recent memoir, wrote about his own experience with his first inaugural, and had Sorensen was kind enough to speak to the speechwriters, and President Obama himself says, his first inaugural was no Kennedy inaugural, but he felt like it reflected his, honest conviction about what America ought to be. We've
dipped into our video archives to pull some examples of presidential speeches as we continue our conversation, but we're going to start with Joe Biden. We're going to play a little clip from his election night speech in Wilmington, and I'd like to have both of you offer your professional opinions of his style, his rhetorical style, as you listen to this clip.
I pledge to be a president who seeks not to divide, but unify, who doesn't see red states and blue states, only sees the United States, and work with all my heart, with the confidence of the whole people, to win the confidence of all of you. And for that is what America, I believe, is about. It's about people. And that's what our administration will be all about. I sought this office to restore the soul of America, to rebuild the backbone of this nation, the middle class, and to make America respected around the world again, and to unite us here at home. It's the honor of my lifetime that so many millions of Americans have voted for that vision.
Let's start with Sarada.
I mean, I think it was sort of quintessential Biden in a way. He truly believes that he can bring people together, and I don't think he's wrong about that. He has long been somebody who is moderate in temperament and moderate in his policies, and is somebody who's known for working across the aisle. And his whole theme throughout the campaign was restoring the soul of America. And I think in sort of speaking to that at that moment and offering a unifying message of, I'm going to do my very best to bring everybody together. He was laying sort of the groundwork. He was actually laying a stake in the ground, frankly, and saying now it's going to be on everybody else to sort of join that vision and to come along and to be willing to be open to repairing our divide. And so I think it was a pretty clear statement of where he wants to go.
Very, very good tone, and if that's going to be the tone of his inaugural address, it will be a success. And the most important thing is, after a presidential election, especially if you win the election, is to stop campaigning. And if Biden just remembers that in his inaugural address, he'll be fine. When I was a boy, I was at the inauguration of Ronald Reagan, and I was a big Reagan fan, admired him as far back as I could remember, and now he was president of the United States. And I was going to hear him speak as president, and I was so excited because I thought I was going to hear something entirely different from what I had heard listening to Ronald Reagan's speeches. And in my immaturity, I remember being a little bit disappointed because it sounded just like he did before he was president. He spoke about the same ideas, the same themes. It wasn't a campaign speech. He wasn't contrasting with anyone else. He wasn't attacking anyone or going down that road. But it was just the same man. And of course, now I look back over the years, and Reagan's inaugural address was one of the best. Consistent with the man's entire career, consistent with his character. And if I were Joe Biden right now, that would be the most important thing to me. That is not to go up there and sound different from the Joe Biden of the past, but to be the best Joe Biden. And so that's what we'll be waiting to see.
Sarada Peri, we've learned from press reports that the incoming White House Director of Speechwriting is Vinay Reddy, who was chief speechwriter for then Vice President Biden during the second Obama term. Sarada Peri, do you know him?
Yes,
do you know how?
Very good. Yeah, he's a very good friend of mine.
Do you know how he works with the Vice President, the incoming president?
Yeah, they have quite a remarkable sort of partnership. They've worked together for a long time, as you said. When I was Vice President Biden's chief speechwriter in the White House, and he knows him, sort of has spent a lot of time with him personally, which is, I think, one of the best ways to develop a writing relationship. And so, they work together on ideas, they work through drafts together. And there are other speechwriters in the team that Vinay has worked with as well, and that Biden has worked with. Longtime advisors like Mike Donilon are always involved. But Vinay is kind of, I think he actually, in a way, shares some of Biden's best qualities. He is a deeply empathetic person. He's a beautiful writer and a brilliant guy, but also somebody who just sort of operates with the same empathy that Biden does. And so I think because they share that sensibility, they have a real sort of connection in terms of their values and how they see the world and how they see worth in every single person. I think you'll see that come out in not just the inaugural, but in all that's to come in terms of the administration and the White House, the speechwriting that will come out of the White House.
We're going to go back in history, and we're going to start with the JFK inaugural, although Sarada, you already talked a bit about that and the relationship with Ted Sorensen. But of course, this is, in the modern age, one of the iconic speeches, the Ask Not speech. Let's listen to a little bit of this.
In the long history of the world, only a few generations have been granted the role of defending freedom in its hour of maximum danger. I do not shrink from this responsibility. I welcome it. I do not believe that any of us would exchange places with any other people or any other generation. The energy, the faith, the devotion which we bring to this endeavor will light our country and all who serve it. And the glow from that fire can truly light the world. And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
So John McConnell, he took office in the height of the Cold War. And while we think of that ask not phrase as and calling us to action for our own country, in fact, most of the speech was about foreign policy issues. What are your observations about this speech?
Well, my general observation, of course, is that is the work of a highly literate, educated man with a natural sense of the English language that was basically unmatched in his generation of politicians. Ted Sorensen was a beautiful writer and a modest man, always gave credit to the president himself, and we know from the documents and from some of the books that have been written about the speech that it really was John F. Kennedy's best in that speech. The collaboration with Sorensen was very important, but I think it was I think Kennedy edited the speech something like 30 times while delivering it, alterations from the text. He was just a person with a natural sense of how words sounded, what the cadence should be, what the choice of words should be, and he could make snap decisions in delivery, and it all just came together in a beautiful piece of work that anyone who's worked on a presidential inaugural address can tell you is very, very hard to do. As you say, it was mostly about foreign policy and about America's place in the world. Harris Wofford, the late senator from Pennsylvania, had a small role in that speech. There was a line where President Kennedy talked about the human rights that America seeks to advance around the world, and the sentence was changed to include the words "at home," and so that was Harris Wofford's influence, and he was simply hoping, in doing that, to have the inaugural address make a reference to civil rights here in the United States.
Sarada Peri, I'm going to move on to 1969 and the first Nixon administration to set the stage, and perhaps some parallels to today. Massive protests going into it over Vietnam, both conventions disrupted with violent protests. He was the only president in the 20th century to be defeated and then come back to win as he took the oath. He said in his memoirs the major theme of his speech was going to be peace. Protesters lined Pennsylvania Avenue. Rocks were thrown at the presidential limo as he moved between the White House and Capitol Hill. 81 people arrested, 12 injured, including one policeman. So that's the background for what we're going to hear next from January 20th, 1969, first Nixon inaugural.
When we listen to the better angels of our nature, we find that they celebrate the simple things, the basic things such as goodness, decency, love, kindness. Greatness comes in simple trappings. The simple things are the ones most needed today if we are to surmount what divides us and cement what unites us. To lower our voices would be a simple thing. In these difficult years, America has suffered from a fever of words, from inflated rhetoric that promises more than it can deliver, from angry rhetoric that fans discontents into hatreds, from bombastic rhetoric that postures instead of persuading. We cannot learn from one another until we stop shouting at one another, until we speak quietly enough so that our words can be heard as well as our voices.
Sarada Peri, what did you hear there?
You know, this is a fascinating speech. As you said, he's delivering it at this moment of incredible crisis. And when people aren't just yelling for the sake of yelling, they are yelling because they have genuine grievances. You know, it followed 1968, the death of two heroes in RFK and MLK, civil rights unrest, the anti-war movement, obviously. It was a moment where people had real grievances and were worried about the state of the country. And it's sort of, you might think that the right thing to say at that moment is to talk about lowering our voices, but it felt a little empty. It wasn't really addressing the very real grievances that people had, or offering a way forward. His speech doesn't have any specific proposals, and that's typical of an inaugural, but he also wasn't necessarily offering sort of a vision of where we wanted to go, which, back to John's earlier point, is kind of the central point of an inaugural, to paint a picture of the vision of the future. And he didn't do that. It was sort of a bland call for unity. It actually reminds me a little bit of some of what we hear today with, calls for civility. But, civility is often a way for those in power to silence those without power. And I feel like Nixon didn't quite strike the right the words he was saying weren't really meeting the moment, although the sentiment of wanting to lower the temperature was understandable and admirable, but that wasn't addressing the real issue, I think. He talks, I remember there's a line, to a crisis of the spirit, we need an answer of the spirit. And that kind of sounds like a pretty line, but it doesn't really mean anything. It doesn't attach itself to anything. But that speech, it was an unusual for a bunch of reasons. One of the funny things about that moment is that Nixon was actually sworn in by Chief Justice Earl Warren, who had been his longtime political rival from California. So the whole thing was sort of just a discordant moment, I think.
John?
I don't know whether the speech was judged a success. It probably was, just because inaugural addresses tend to be well received. I'll just note that at the beginning, Nixon talked about the better angels of our nature, which of course is a conscious echo of President Lincoln's first inaugural address, the closing passage of President Lincoln's first inaugural address. And that term, better angels, we've heard from Biden, and we may hear again on Inauguration Day.
As we move on through history, President Nixon's second speech in 1973, which we're not going to show a clip from, but it's interesting in reading about it, he used the word peace 19 times in that speech, more than any other presidential reference. In fact, if you combine several inaugural speeches together, he uses it more than that. What does that suggest to you in terms of where he thought the country needed to be?
Well, Nixon, in his first inaugural address, I think, is where he said the greatest title that history can bestow is the title of peacemaker. It was very much on his mind, and that actually is the epitaph on his tombstone.
Interesting. We're going to move on to Ronald Reagan's first, and John McConnell, you talked about this being the first inaugural address that you heard in person, 1981. It set the stage for us rather than me doing it. What was the country going through as he was beginning to take the oath of office?
Well, actually, the first one I heard in person was Carter in '77 when I was a little boy, and that was on the east front of the Capitol. And then 4 years later, as Carter was leaving and Ronald Reagan was coming in, the inauguration, of course, had been moved to the west front of the Capitol for the first time. Reagan has given credit for that, but in truth, that was done by Congress, and Carter's second inauguration, had he been reelected, would have been on the west front of the Capitol. I just remember it as a very unusual day, just having seen the Carter event 4 years before, and then having read about other inaugurations. It's January 20th. It tends to be mighty cold, and the randomly chosen January 20th going through the years. Ronald Reagan's inauguration day, I think it was 55. I know it was 55 or 60 degrees. People were bundled up, but it was just a beautiful, beautiful day. A little bit overcast, and but got sunny around noontime, and it was also a formal event. President Reagan was dressed in morning clothes, and that was the dress code. So everybody on the platform, including the outgoing president and vice president, were all dressed in formal attire. And I think the only other inauguration to have a formal dress code in modern times was John F. Kennedy's. So it was I just remember it as a very polished event, beautiful day, and the country was, we'd gone through a divisive election. There had been 3 candidates for president. Third-party candidate, I think, got 5% of the vote. Reagan ended up winning 44 states. President Carter carried only 6. But Carter, 4 years before, in his inaugural address, had begun his remarks by thanking President Ford for all he had done to heal the nation. Ronald Reagan, at the beginning of his inaugural address, thanked Jimmy Carter for his assistance in the transition. And from then on, inaugural addresses have had explicit thanks to the outgoing president.
Ronald Reagan's chief speechwriter for this, Ken Kashigian. Let's listen to about a minute and 14 of January 20th, 1981, Ronald Reagan's first inaugural.
The economic ills we suffer have come upon us over several decades. They will not go away in days, weeks, or months, but they will go away. They will go away because we, as Americans, have the capacity now, as we've had in the past, to do whatever needs to be done to preserve this last and greatest bastion of freedom. In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. It's my intention to curb the size and influence of the federal establishment and to demand recognition of the distinction between the powers granted to the federal government and those reserved to the states or to the people. All of us need to be reminded that the federal government did not create the states. The states created the federal government.
Sarada Peri, Ronald Reagan ushering in the new federalism era. What did you hear there?
The folks involved in the speech's preparations said that it would sort of set a tone rather than an agenda. And I think he did do that, although in the tone of sort of calling for, the end of big government, did set an agenda. In truth, the rhetoric of the speech is, sort of Reagan at his finest. But what you hear is sort of ironically the person who's taking over the government, demonizing the government, which I suppose is what he had done throughout the campaign and what he did in his 8 years in office. But it was sort of quintessential Reagan in that sense. As John said earlier, he didn't deviate from anything really that he had said in the campaign. And he didn't offer anything new from that perspective either, not that he had to. But the vision that he was putting forward was almost entirely about reducing the strength and power of the federal government, and that was not new from what he had been doing.
Another interesting thing about the Reagan inaugural address is that, unlike a lot of other inaugural addresses, Reagan really made an argument in that speech, and he's often quoted just in the abstract. You hear people say Reagan was the one who said government's not the solution, government's the problem. And we just heard that line from the speech. But what he said in the speech was, in this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problems. And he was making an argument, which was that A, government had shown signs of growing beyond the consent of the governed, and B, that despite the size and strength and scope of the government, it still had not, it still exceeded the tax revenues of the government, and therefore you had deficits, you had inflation, all of these problems that he talked about. So when he said government is not the solution, he was saying government has done these things, and therefore it is the problem.
Susan, one more interesting thought about this speech one interesting thing about the speech is that it ended up having resonance in terms of, as John said, making an argument for a philosophy, really, of how government ought to work. And I think it was in this inaugural where he made the comparison between, a family staying within its budget and the federal government staying within its budget. And that has resonated in terms of people who believe in that argument of economic theory, that a federal government ought to manage its budget the way a family does. Whether or not economists agree with that has staying power in terms of being a rhetorical argument for Reagan's philosophy of government.
Next, we'll look at 1993, the first inaugural of Bill Clinton, the generational change to the first baby boomer president. And his theme was American Renewal. This is from January 20th, 1993, first Clinton inaugural, about 1:15.
Our democracy must be not only the envy of the world, but the engine of our own renewal. There is nothing wrong with America that cannot be cured by what is right with America. And so today we pledge an end to the era of deadlock and drift, and a new season of American renewal has begun. To renew America, we must be bold. We must do what no generation has had to do before. We must invest more in our own people, in their jobs, and in their future, and at the same time, cut our massive debt. And we must do so in a world in which we must compete for every opportunity. It will not be easy. It will require sacrifice. But it can be done and done fairly, not choosing sacrifice for its own sake, but for our own sake.
Let's start with John this time. What did you hear in that speech versus what the Clinton presidency was like?
Well, it pretty much fits with how his presidency turned out in terms of the economic successes. It's interesting in that 2 years later, he was facing a Republican House and a Republican Senate that had run on a set platform, made a congressional midterm election a nationwide election. And Clinton had to contend with that Republican Congress for the next 6 years, and had in economic terms, a successful presidency, and maybe that's the divided government was part of the reason for that.
And ultimately, of course, impeachment. Sarada Peri,
yes.
Your thoughts about what you heard? The era of deadlock is over, and also his concern about the debt.
It's interesting. As John said, it certainly wasn't over, and a couple of years later, it would only get more entrenched. And one might argue that the revolution of 1994, led by Gingrich, hearkened to sort of new era of rancorous partisanship that we're still living with, and so. It wasn't prescient in that way, although, of course, he was able to oversee a strong economy. And, it's interesting, by that point, Democrats had taken on the same language of debt that had started earlier in Reagan's term. And this was also a lot of what Clinton faced in terms of criticism from the left wing of his own party, that he was too moderate, that he was thinking too much about debt, that he pursued policies like welfare reform that progressives were vehemently against. And so you start to see seeds of what his administration will look like, what his White House will look like in terms of trying to appeal to all sides of the party. And I will say, too, that what's striking about the language is his use of renewal. I think he even starts the speech talking about how, it's a cold winter day, but we're starting to see the renewal of spring. And it was in a way that was really a tone, a commentary about the tone of the moment. He offered a really beautiful tribute to President George H.W. Bush, who, of course, gave a lifetime of service to the country, and he also was turning the page to a new generation, his own generation. And the first baby boomer president. And you see it even more later in 1997. In his second inaugural address, which was the first one I attended in person. I was a senior in high school, and you're struck by the moment that he is speaking, of course, throughout his presidency, but especially at that second inaugural, where, we've got the internet is getting bigger, younger generation coming up more aware of technology and its role, and President Clinton trying to figure out what role America has in sort of leading this revolution, building the bridge to the 21st century became his catchphrase. And so he really did take office and lead in a time that was pivotal, not just for America, but for the world in terms of where we were going heading into a new century.
And give him credit for setting that right tone and talking about the importance of, or his aspiration of putting an era of deadlock and division behind us. Who knows whether he thought the chances of that were great or small, but at least we have to credit him for wanting to get past it.
So we're going to go next to the new millennium, George W. Bush, 20 years ago. Hard to believe that it was 20 years already. But here he is on January 20th of 2001. And I want to play this clip, and then I'm going to ask if our director can then move right into his second inaugural. Because, of course, the first one took place before anyone had conceived of 9/11. And I want to have you compare the tones in the two speeches just 4 years apart. So let's listen to George W. Bush's first inaugural, and then we'll take a break and come back and listen to his second inaugural.
The peaceful transfer of authority is rare in history, yet common in our country. With a simple oath, we affirm old traditions and make new beginnings. As I begin, I thank President Clinton for his service to our nation. And I thank Vice President Gore for a contest conducted with spirit and ended with grace. The ambitions of some Americans are limited by failing schools and hidden prejudice and the circumstances of their birth. And sometimes our differences run so deep, it seems we share a continent, but not a country. We do not accept this, and we will not allow it. Our unity, our union, is the serious work of leaders and citizens in every generation. And this is my solemn pledge. I will work to build a single nation of justice and opportunity.
That was George W. Bush's first inaugural address, and now we'll listen to a portion of his second inaugural address.
There is only one force of history that can break the reign of hatred and resentment and expose the pretensions of tyrants and reward the hopes of the decent and tolerant, and that is the force of human freedom. We are led by events and common sense to one conclusion: the survival of liberty in our land increasingly depends on the success of liberty in other lands. The best hope for peace in our world is the expansion of freedom in all the world.
John, let's start with you. Were you involved in either of these speeches?
The second inaugural address, yes, I worked with my colleague Mike Gerson, although I have to say that Mike was the real intellectual driver of that speech, and he's the one who had spent the most time with the president talking about it. But we did spend a week or so together on the drafting. The first inaugural address, I did not. It was Mike and our colleague Matthew Scully.
Our world had changed a lot in that 4 years. How do we hear that in the tones in the two speeches?
Well, it's been a while since I listened to either one of them, but I remember just impressionistically, my memory is that they both sounded a lot like him, because in each case he spent so much time working on the speech. That was true for all the years I worked for him. Speeches were very important to him, and he wanted to bond with the speech by the time he got up and delivered it. He wanted it to be the representation of his best thoughts. He thought every speech was important. And so, in looking back and listening to those inaugural addresses, it really sounds like him because it is him. A good-hearted man, a man clear in his purposes and eager to explain them to the audience.
Sarada Peri, William Safire reported that that George W. Bush told Michael Gerson, "I want my second inaugural to be the freedom speech." And in fact, he used the word freedom 27 times in that speech. What's your reaction?
Well, given where we were at that point, at that point we were knee deep in the Iraq War, obviously after 9/11, it makes sense. Freedom at that moment, if we go back in time, had sort of an outsized, almost mythic quality to it, not always tethered to meaning for people, but it very much was in the air, and became in some corners a source of derision, because whose freedom were we fighting for, and what were we doing in terms of the Iraq War. But I think that after 9/11, that tone of speaking for freedom from terrorism here, but also for democracy abroad, was really important for President Bush. And I also wanted to say that what struck me in going, I hadn't gone back and listened or read to those inaugurals in a long time, but going back to that first one, it, of course, before 9/11, it's, first of all, it's a beautifully written speech, and parts of it sound like so different from what you might hear today. There's a line where he says, "It's the American story, a story of flawed and fallible people united across the generations by grand and enduring ideals." I mean, today, I don't know if you would hear a Republican say that the American story is a story of flawed and fallible people. There is an argument being had today, not just between historians, but between politicians about what is the American story, and is it unpatriotic to look back and question some of the choices that were made, and to call out our flaws. And so it struck me that that President Bush did sort of put that in a really elegant way in his first inaugural.
So we move on to the Barack Obama presidency. And Sarada, we're going to turn to you for some background on how these speeches were crafted. What can you tell us about them?
So I was not involved in crafting either of them, but my understanding is that the first speech, President Obama worked with his longtime chief speechwriter, Jon Favreau, and John has said that it was one of the hardest speeches he worked on. He said the same about the second inaugural. And President Obama has said that first inaugural happened, it was sort of a whirlwind of a time. He had obviously just come off of the campaign, but we were in the middle. He immediately inherited this financial crisis, and the transition, as John will know better than anyone, was basically just a series of meetings about how bad things were. So it was a really challenging time, and the speechwriters had actually met with Ted Sorensen to get his advice, and he basically said whenever we had a big speech to write, we just said, let's make sure this one hits the history books. And I don't know if that was for inspiration or fear, but for President Obama, he just wanted it, I think, to be a more sober tone, and less maybe lofty and rhetorical than what people had heard in the campaign and what people expected, because the moment called for that. As we talked about earlier, inaugurations are the first official speech as president. You're not campaigning anymore. And he was coming into a very serious situation, and had worked with President Bush throughout the transition to sort of, be ready to take on the role of governing. That old adage, you campaign in poetry, but you govern in prose. And this speech was prose.
There was this interesting little paragraph from The Guardian about Jon Favreau and his relationship with the president in writing this. The inaugural speech is shuttled between the two of them 4 or 5 times following an initial hour-long meeting in which the president-elect spoke about his vision for the address, and Favreau took notes on his computer. He then went away and spent weeks on research. His team interviewed historians and speechwriters, studied periods of crisis, and listened to past inaugural orations. And when ready, he took up residence in a Starbucks in Washington and wrote the first draft. That process probably sounds familiar to both of you as presidential speechwriters. We're going to listen to Barack Obama's first inaugural address, and then, John, when we come back, let's hear what you have to say about it.
That we are in the midst of crisis is now well understood. Our nation is at war against a far-reaching network of violence and hatred. Our economy is badly weakened, a consequence of greed and irresponsibility on the part of some, but also our collective failure to make hard choices and prepare the nation for a new age. Homes have been lost, jobs shed, businesses shuttered. Our health care is too costly, our schools fail too many, and each day brings further evidence that the ways we use energy strengthen our adversaries and threaten our planet. These are the indicators of crisis, subject to data and statistics. Less measurable, but no less profound, is a sapping of confidence across our land. A nagging fear that America's decline is inevitable, that the next generation must lower its sights. Today, I say to you that the challenges we face are real. They are serious and they are many. They will not be met easily or in a short span of time. But know this, America, they will be met.
John?
Isn't that interesting? There's a line in the Reagan address where he talks about our problems not going away in days, weeks, or months, but they will go away. And Obama says something very similar to that. And that's a lesson for inaugural addresses. The country likes hearing a president, especially an incoming president in whom they've invested their confidence, say something like that. We can get through this. Whatever we're facing, we can get through it. I just want to add that I've been reading President Obama's book. I don't remember knowing this at the time. I was on the White House staff until the morning of the inauguration, and I wouldn't have known this, but I don't remember reading about it since until I read Obama's book. He was briefed the night before and told that there was a credible threat of a terrorist attack at the inauguration. And so he had in his jacket pocket a set of instructions to read to the audience to tell them how to get away and how to get away from the scene and go on to safety. I'd never heard that story, and it's pretty jarring when you think about it.
And as the fences are going up right across the street from us as we talk right now, again, reminiscent of the times that we're going through as Joe Biden takes makes his inaugural address. We have about 8 minutes left. I have time to do President Obama's second inaugural, this clip is about a minute long. Let's listen to how his themes changed in his second oath of office.
We must be a source of hope to the poor, the sick, the marginalized, the victims of prejudice, not out of mere charity, but because peace in our time requires the constant advance of those principles that our common creed describes: tolerance and opportunity, human dignity, and justice. For our journey is not complete until our wives, our mothers, and daughters can earn a living equal to their efforts. Our journey is not complete until our gay brothers and sisters are treated like anyone else under the law. For if we are truly created equal, then surely the love we commit to one another must be equal as well. Our journey is not complete until no citizen is forced to wait for hours to exercise the right to vote. Our journey is not complete until we find a better way to welcome the striving, hopeful immigrants who still see America as a land of opportunity.
Sarada Peri, we hear policy initiatives in this second inaugural address.
We do, and all of them have a tone of sort of full-throated progressivism, right? I mean, this is somebody who just won re-election, and it was always obviously a historic moment when President Obama won the first time. But I've heard longtime people who have worked with President Obama say, in a way that could have been a fluke, but for him to be reelected had so much meaning. And so not only did it have sort of emotional and symbolic resonance, but it also meant this was somebody who was never going to run for office again. And he, knowing that he was going to have a Congress that would oppose him at this point, he was in a position to sort of say, I'm gonna push for the progressive legislation that I want. And it was in this speech that he had used the phrase earlier, but when he used the phrase from Seneca Falls to Selma to Stonewall. And he had used that in a commencement that he had given at Barnard University in 2012, but they brought it back for this speech because it had sort of gotten lost. And it has since kind of taken on its own resonance, to tie Stonewall to these other two civil rights moments of consequence for our country was sort of a watershed moment in terms of the rhetoric around rights for the LGBTQ community. And so it was a pretty forward-thinking speech and a forward-leaning speech, and certainly painting a picture of a president who intends to push for big ideas.
John McConnell, we have about 5 minutes left, and I do want to get President Trump's 2017 speech in here, written with the help of Stephen Miller and Steve Bannon. This is about another minute and 15 clip. Let's listen.
Mothers and children trapped in poverty in our inner cities, rusted out factories scattered like tombstones across the landscape of our nation, an education system flush with cash, but which leaves our young and beautiful students deprived of all knowledge. And the crime, and the gangs, and the drugs that have stolen too many lives and robbed our country of so much unrealized potential. This American carnage stops right here and stops right now. We assembled here today are issuing a new decree to be heard in every city, in every foreign capital, and in every hall of power. From this day forward, a new vision will govern our land. From this day forward, it's going to be only America first. America first.
John McConnell?
Well, that was vintage Donald Trump. Just as a speechwriter, I was always hesitant, and I think, and I can tell you, my bosses, George W. Bush, Dick Cheney, Dan Quayle before that, there was always a sensitivity to saying something completely categorical, such as, this stops right here, right now. Is that right? Is this really true that something stops here and now? I think sometimes in politics there can be over-promising and overstating, and sometimes in inaugural addresses, and there are other examples of that.
Sarada Peri, what are your thoughts in listening to that speech from 4 years ago?
Actually, it's funny. I had a similar reaction to John, which is, making categorical assertions of anything is a dangerous move to make. I was struck by that phrase. Our children are devoid of all knowledge. That's not something that my bosses, any of the people I've ever worked for, would ever allow to be written. But what is chilling about it actually is that his suggestion of American carnage was really just more prophecy and prediction than it was an accurate picture of what was happening at the time. I mean, he had just inherited a growing economy from President Obama, and the economic growth that continued under him had started before him. And he was painting sort of a false picture of what was happening. But the phrase in particular, American carnage, is sort of haunting, considering what he unleashed, just a few days ago at the Capitol. It is a striking comparison if you side by side, if you put the two pictures together. And I think somebody who speaks in such absolutes, and who at the convention had said, "I alone can fix it," is probably not going to be the kind of leader who's going to offer a affirmative, forward-looking vision that brings along all Americans and leads us to a better place.
Well, you both have been terrific looking back in history for us on past presidential inaugurals. We have about 2 minutes left. I'm going to ask each of you to close almost where we began. If you were working with incoming President Joe Biden on his inaugural address at this point, what would your best advice to him be? Sarada, let's start with you.
My advice to him would be my advice to anybody who is giving a speech, which is, what is the one true thing that you can say, and to speak to this particular moment in the most honest way that you possibly can.
And John McConnell, your advice?
Take yes for an answer. You are President of the United States. The campaign is over. The country is looking to you with great expectations, great goodwill. This is not a country obsessed with politics. This is a country that has a lot of problems and a nasty tone in its politics. None of that has to be reflected in the inaugural address. You are the president. Look forward, look ahead, tell the country where you want to go, what you want to do. It's not about your adversaries. It's not about who you defeated. It's about you, and this is probably, you're probably not going to run for office again, so just be every inch the President of the United States. But he doesn't need my advice.
Sarada Peri, John McConnell, both former presidential speechwriters, thank you so much for spending an hour with C-SPAN in advance of Joe Biden's inaugural. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to C-SPAN's Q&A, and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcast so you'll never miss an episode. And while you're there, please take a minute to rate and review us. You can also send us an email about Q&A at podcasts@c-span.org. Send me your questions, your comments, or ideas. Your feedback is welcome.